formation. So what happens is, as we go higher from the surface of the earth, temperature keeps decreasing. So as you go higher, the temperature would decrease. As you go higher, temperature decreases. Fine. So that means as air moves up, it gets cooler and cooler, because at higher heights the temperature is less. So the air which goes to the higher heights, they get cooler. So at large heights, so let's say when the air moves up, what is happening? The air is getting cooler. Now at sufficiently large heights, air is cool enough to cause condensation, because at lower heights also water vapor is present, but the air is not cold enough to cause condensation. But when it reaches sufficiently higher heights, the air is a lot cooler. So now the air is cool enough to cause condensation. Now when it causes condensation, what happens? Water vapor gets converted to tiny droplets of water. So these tiny droplets of water keep floating as long as they are not very heavy. So these tiny droplets of water are like very light. Each droplet is very light. So since they are very light, they tend to float in the sky. Now sometimes what happens? All these tiny droplets, they start combining together. So let's say 2-3 droplets started combining together. Gradually, when a huge number of droplets get combined together, they become heavy. Now when they become heavy, they cannot stay there anymore. So when they become heavy, they drop on the surface. Now, as long as they are floating in the sky, we see them as clouds. So as the air becomes cooler, condensation happens. That is, water vapor which was present in the atmosphere gets converted to liquid water droplets. Now these tiny liquid water droplets are very light. Therefore, they keep floating in the sky, right? But when a lot of such tiny droplets, so what we see as floating in the sky is cloud. So cloud is nothing but the condensed water droplets. That's cloud. Cloud is condensed water droplets. But when a lot of droplets like this, they combine together, they tend to become heavy. And when they become heavy, what happens? They fall as rain on the surface of the earth. So that's how you see cloud formation results in rainfall. So what is this cloud? Cloud is nothing but condensed water vapor or condensed water droplets, whatever you call it. So water vapor in the condensed form, in the form of tiny water droplets, that's cloud. But when the cloud becomes very heavy, it falls as rain. And that's how the water vapor gets converted into liquid water. So what we learned is clouds are condensed water vapor floating in the atmosphere well above the ground. So that's why clouds are not like very reachable to us. Now why clouds are formed quite above the ground level? That's because, as I said, that as you go up, the temperature would decrease. Therefore, as the air moves up, the air becomes cooler. So when the air reaches sufficiently large heights, only at that height, the air becomes so cool that it can cause condensation. And that is why the water vapor gets condensed to form what? To form clouds. So this cloud formation can take place only at higher heights, because only at higher heights the temperature is sufficiently low. So that's the reason we see clouds only well above the ground level. So let us now see that how water is going from the ground to the atmosphere, again coming back from the atmosphere to the ground. So this will be like a complete cycle or a complete circulation. So let's see. So whatever we have studied so far, we can summarize that in this way. So we see that water from the ground gets converted into water vapor in the air by the process of evaporation. So by evaporation, water is changing to water vapor. So water is basically going from the ground to the air. There is another process, transpiration, where water from the plants, that is water from the ground, is going to get converted into water vapor in the atmosphere. So now what do we have? as a result of evaporation and transpiration, we have a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. So now these water vapor in the atmosphere, they condense together to form clouds, and when these clouds, they become very dense, very heavy, they fall on the earth or fall back to the ground in the form of rainfall. So we see that the water which was in the ground goes to the atmosphere, again comes back to the ground. So it is like a complete cycle. So we see water keeps moving to and from the ground. So much of water which is coming to the ground. So where does the rainwater accumulate? Where does this rainwater go? So some part of the rainwater remains on the surface, that is, they remain on the land, and then from land it might flow into rivers or streams. It goes to various water bodies like ponds, lakes, rivers, oceans. In fact, if there is no rainfall for a very long time, you would have noticed that the ponds, lakes, rivers, oceans, they all start drying up. Not the oceans, I would say, but at least the ponds and lakes, you can very evidently see that they start drying up due to lack of rainfall. Some part of the rainwater also gets absorbed by the ground, and that is where we talk about groundwater. Now, have you ever noticed that when you water a plant in a pot, what happens to that water? So immediately after you have put a lot of water to a plant or on the soil on which that plant is there, after a couple of minutes you see that the entire water goes into the soil. So the soil has absorbed the entire water. So how does that happen? That happens because there are pores, there are spaces within the soil particles, and water is stored in those spaces. So in a similar way, whenever it rains, it falls on the ground, and then a lot of water is absorbed by the ground. Now again, when I say ground, it means when it falls on the soil. Now if the same water falls on a mosaic floor, definitely it will not get into the soil. So in that case, the water will pass through the mosaic floor, and maybe it will go to the nearby drain, and from there it will enter a river or a stream. But if it falls on a muddy surface, if it falls on a field, or it falls on an agricultural land, so in all of those cases, the water actually seeps inside the soil, and that forms the groundwater. That is why, have you observed that if people start digging below the earth's surface, now after you have dug up to a certain level, you start finding water below the surface of the earth. So that water which exists below the earth's surface is called groundwater. And how do we fetch groundwater? In form of wells, tube wells, hand pumps. So they all fetch groundwater and make it available for us. So if you have ever seen a well, what is it? So you keep digging below the earth's surface, you reach a certain level where you can find water, so you still dig a little more, and then that's how you construct a well. So every time you go to that well, you are able to find some water there. So that's groundwater. So now, based on whatever we have learned so far, we can understand the entire water cycle now, that how water moves from one part of the earth to the other, how it circulates between air, surface, and below the earth's surface. So movement of water within the earth. When I say within the earth, it would include in the atmosphere or in the air, on the surface of the earth, below the surface of the earth. So how it circulates between these three regions. So let us see how exactly the water cycle takes place, or how exactly the circulation of water takes place. So from the land we see that evaporation takes place, because of which liquid water gets converted to water vapor. So evaporation is one such process, and the other process is transpiration. So transpiration and evaporation. So as a result of these processes, water vapor gets collected in the atmosphere. Now what happens to these water vapors? So all these water vapor, they condense to form clouds. So these water vapor condense to form clouds. And how this condensation happens? It happens at a greater heights where the temperature is low enough for condensation to take place. So as a result of condensation, cloud formation takes place, and then these clouds result in the rainfall. So when the clouds become very heavy, they cause rainfall. Now as a result of rainfall, what happens? Water gets collected on the land, and then these water from the land flows down into the water bodies, and rainfall directly also falls on the water bodies. Again, the water which is present on the water bodies, from there again evaporation happens during sunlight, and then again the same process. So water vapor gets collected in the atmosphere. So with evaporation, water vapor gets collected in the atmosphere. As a result, condensation happens, again cloud formation, again rainfall. So this is like a cyclic process. So evaporation, transpiration, all these result in a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. These water vapor, they condense at a lower temperature at very high heights, at good heights, and result in the formation of clouds. When the clouds become heavy enough, they cause rainfall, and then again rainfall fills the water bodies, and again evaporation of water takes place in presence of sunlight. So that's how the entire water cycle keeps continuing, and this cycle never stops. So this is a continuous process. It keeps taking place all the time. The water cycle, it becomes important to talk about rainfall. Now, rainfall plays a very crucial role, especially in a country like India. So here rainfall is important because agriculture is largely dependent on rains. Now, as I mentioned before, that for agriculture to take place, for the crops to get cultivated properly, they need to be watered correctly. So that means water need to be given to the plants. So in India, we largely depend on rainfall so that our fields get watered. Now, agriculture is dependent on rain. So if there is no rain, there will be no agriculture. If there is no agriculture, there will be no food for us. So the living organisms would not be able to survive. Another importance of rainfall is that it fills the rivers, lakes and oceans, and we need water for so many purposes in our day-to-day life. So we get all that water from the nearby lakes and rivers. So if they are filled enough with water, so that would be better for us. Supports all life forms. It supports all life forms. As I said, water is important for all life forms. Now, when this rainfall fills the water bodies like rivers, lakes and oceans, it also supports a huge number of aquatic life, aquatic organisms which live in these water bodies. So that means rainfall is very, very important. Now, when we talk about rainfall, what becomes more important to discuss is that sometimes there is excess of rainfall, sometimes there is no rainfall at all. Now, both of these situations are not good to have situations. So, rainfall can cause problems. Now, if there is no rainfall at all, that can result in a drought. If there is too much of rainfall, that can result in floods. And in both of these cases, a huge damage to life and property takes place. So when there is a flood, there is so much of water everywhere that buildings collapse, there is loss of property, organisms die, lot of huge loss of life as well. Similarly, when the reverse scenario happens, that there is no rainfall at all, in that case there is a very, very poor effect on the agriculture. So we do not have enough crops. So when there is not enough crops, we do not have enough food to eat. So that way also a lot of people die out of hunger, a lot of diseases spread out due to drought. So lack of rainfall also impacts us, excess of rainfall also impacts us. Now let us quickly look at the problems that can happen due to excess of rainfall, that is flood and its harmful effects. So as a result of floods, there could be soil erosion. What is soil erosion? Carrying away of the upper layer of soil by water. When so much of water is flowing over the surface, what happens is the top layer of soil is being carried away by the water. So top layers of soil are carried away with water. So what happens as a result of this? Now the top layers of soil are comparatively more fertile. So the fertile layers are carried away. That means the soil which you are left with is no more that fertile. So that will not support the growth of plants. So that way soil erosion is a bad thing to happen. Secondly, destroy forest ecosystem. Now inside the forest we have huge number of trees, we have huge number of animals, insects, birds and so many organisms which are mutually dependent on each other. But due to flood, the trees are carried away by the water, so the entire vegetation is spoiled, so many animals die, so in the entire ecosystem within the forest is destroyed completely. Loss of property, because huge buildings, offices, everything gets broken, everything gets carried away by water. Crop fields underwater, as I said. Agriculture, for agriculture we need water, but if you put too much of water in the agricultural field also, then what happens is the entire crops or the plants, they go completely underwater. So even with excess of water, when there is water logging, then the plants also tend to die. Villages, towns and cities destroyed. So the entire establishment of humans get affected. Loss of species. Many a times it so happens that some species of animals which are already rare, maybe a few of them exist now. So even they die as a result of flood, and therefore we lose that species forever. Or sometimes it also happens that a particular species of an animal, they reside in a particular area. They are found only in a particular geographic location. But due to flood in that location, you ended up having all those animals killed. So as a result, this would lead to the loss of species. So you might ask here, what is a species? So species refers to a group of organisms that can interbreed. So what do we mean by that? Let's say if you talk about dogs. So there can be multiple species of dogs. So those types of dogs which can interbreed to give rise to a new organism, or they can mutually mate to give rise to their young ones. They are said to belong to the same species. So group of organisms which can interbreed amongst themselves. So we can say that, let's say there is a cat and a dog. Do you think they both belong to the same species? Definitely not. So the same is true for other animals also. So only similar types of animals fall under the category of same species. Now let us look at the other extreme scenario, that is the harmful effects of drought. So in this case, groundwater level will get lowered because there is no rainfall since a very long time. So no rainfall, that means no groundwater, because groundwater, the only source for groundwater is the rainfall. So when there is no rainfall, so the groundwater level will get lower. So you can understand this by performing a very simple experiment. Try to dig below the surface of the earth in an area which gets sufficient rainfall, and try to do the same activity in an area which did not receive rainfall for a couple of months in the past. So, and you will note a difference. So in the first case where there is sufficient rainfall, you will see that very quickly you will reach that level where you will be able to see water. Whereas in the second case, that is in case of an area with no rainfall in the last few months, you will see that you will actually need to dig a lot to reach a level where there is water. And sometimes the condition can be so severe that you keep on digging it, but you do not get trace of any water. Destroy forest ecosystem. So when there will be no water, so the surface will all be dry. As a result, the plants will also dry up. Plants will die. So the animals which are dependent on plants for their food, they would also die. So the entire ecosystem will again get spoiled. Water level decreases in water bodies like ponds, rivers and lakes. Sometimes due to drought, they might even dry out completely. You do not see a drop of water in the water bodies. Dry soil. So as I said, that when we water plants, the water gets stored between the soil particles. But now when there is no rainfall at all, so obviously there is no water that is actually entering into the soil. Therefore the soil remains dry. no crop cultivation, hence lack of food. So agriculture is totally dependent on rainfall to some extent. So when there is no rainfall at all for a long time, in that case the crop cultivation will get adversely impacted and there will be shortage of food. So organisms will not be able to survive. So we see that both floods and droughts have their own harmful effects, and that is why it is very important that rainfall happens at the right quantity. So it shouldn't be either excess of rainfall or it shouldn't be either lack of rainfall since a very long time. So now that we saw that rainfall, if it happens in excess, can be disastrous in the form of flood. Similarly, if it doesn't happen at all since long time, it can be equally disastrous in the form of drought. Now, as a result of flood and drought, who are the common victims in both the cases? So the common victims are the forests. You look at the animals living in the forests, the birds, insects, even the tiny organisms, the plants, all these life forms are adversely impacted as a result of flood and drought. So that is why it is said that it is very important to maintain the right amount of water on this earth, because water is something which is very precious, very crucial for the survival of all life forms.